Welcome to Podcast, the Business of Dentistry podcast, brought to you by Practice Plan. Podcast delivers the best business advice, real-life stories, and practical hints and tips to make your practice a more profitable and sustainable business. And now, here's your host.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be with everyone listening today and to be joined by John Renshaw, who's someone I've watched and admired for most of my 30-something year career in dentistry. So welcome, John.
I'm delighted to be here, and your 30 years pales into insignificance compared to my 60.
With that in mind, I think it's probably worthwhile, before we embark on an exploration of your thoughts about where the future of NHS dentistry is taking us, and just understand a little bit about your background and your perspectives, because actually they're quite different to your average GDP, for example.
Yes. What happened to me was that I arrived on the scene as a dentist in 1969 and took my first job. And I quickly realized that although the business was very successful and very remunerative, it was actually going nowhere. The industry was standing looking at itself most of the time, and the NHS didn't seem to be paying any attention to it. So I set myself a target of trying to get into the LDC and therefore try to make my way into understanding better the NHS. And I followed that through to the completely illogical conclusion of ending up advising Secretaries of State for Health on matters not relating to dentistry. So the NHS is a major part of my background in a way that very, very few dentists ever could claim. Now, there are some, and I know most of them by name, but most of them are not practicing dentists. And that's the difference, that I was a practicing dentist throughout the whole of my career, and everything I was doing was talking about me and how it impacted on me in my business, not me being a politician pretending to be running for high office.
Yes, well, I mean, that makes perfect sense, and that chimes with my impression of you throughout the years. And I think what I found quite interesting was that I would say my early impressions of you, John, were as someone that was really trying to champion the NHS and try and make it fit for purpose. And then there seems to have come a point where you thought this is just not going to be possible. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely, because in 1970 and 1980, I thought the NHS was the best thing since sliced bread. The idea of it I found extremely attractive. The ability to provide first-class healthcare to the whole population using a government-funded umbrella organisation was very, very interesting to me. And it was only round about the late 1990s and the early 2000s that I began to realise that actually the NHS was not really interested in dentistry and was only willing to buy it up to a limit, and with great regret at having to spend the money. And that's when my view changed, and I realised that we were being taken for granted, that our contribution to healthcare was seen as of no consequence by the hierarchy of the NHS, and that, in my view, the move into independent practice was not only a good idea, it was actually our best defence mechanism we could come up with, because it allowed us to have a position at the table ourselves without being dependent on the NHS for all our funding.
And that's very interesting. I mean, obviously, we've got a commercial agenda in terms of helping dentists leave the NHS and go private. And a lot of what we do, I've certainly seen most of my career, is about giving confidence to dentists to take control of their circumstances. Now, it sounds like at that time, that late 90s, early 2000s, you were getting some insights into the way government were thinking. What was your role at that point? What were you involved in?
Well, I was a member of, I was a director of the North Yorkshire Health Authority at that time. We had 5 major hospitals under our control, and I was a board member. not because I was a dentist, but because I was a well-known leading figure in North Yorkshire at the time. And I began to realise and listen to conversations that were taking place where other people had clearly forgotten that I was a dentist and were saying things that I don't think they would have said to me if they'd known or remembered that I was a dentist. And I began thinking, these people are leading us up the garden path. There is a huge problem with the NHS, a gigantic problem of cost for the NHS. There isn't enough money in the kitty. And what they're doing is they're casting around looking for places to save money. And I thought, I know where they're looking. They're looking at dentistry as a good way of hiving off one quite large lump of NHS responsibility in order to distribute that money in a more efficient way as far as they were concerned. And that was when I began to start having great reservations about their willingness. And in fact, what I did was but by that time I was becoming a big name at the BDA, and I persuaded the BDA to address the issue of our profession's place in the healthcare environment looking to the future. That was in 1996. And we had a big roundtable affair with lots and lots of important people there. And it was very interesting to hear everybody's views on it. And that was the start for me of a change of heart that was really radical. But can I just say, Nigel, that I'd been doing private dentistry since the mid-1970s. I started doing NHS from the start, like everybody else did. But it became very clear to me that my senior partner, the guy who owned the business, was doing private work, which I hadn't even thought about at that time. And then I thought, actually, that's not a bad idea. I don't think that's as, and everybody at the time said, oh no, you don't want to be doing that. You know, stick to the NHS. That's the right place to be. And I thought, you know what? I'm not really convinced of that argument. I'm going to do my little bit of private work. So I'd been looking at sitting in two seats at the table at the same time for a very, very long time before it came to 1990s. So if you like, the transition took me a long time, but nevertheless, it meant I was still a leading expert on the NHS, but I also had a considerable grounding in the provision of dental care in the private sector.
What's interesting there, John, is that so 96 roundtable discussion, 97 we end up with a Labour government. So a lot of those discussions you were having in the late 90s, early 2000s were under a Labour government, traditionally seen as supporters of the NHS. And here we are now talking with another Labour government in situ, albeit not for very long. What's your sense of where they might be thinking about NHS dentistry? Is it different to the Blair government, or is it pretty much the same?
No, I think the Blair government had the shock of the lifetime when they actually decided to put the extra money into the NHS in 2000. They actually increased the funding available for the NHS in whole, the whole system, went up from £100 billion a year to £120 billion. And I was told face to face by Alan Milburn, dentistry was going to get nothing, not one penny of that. But the great interesting fact that came out of it was the £20 billion evaporated. It achieved nothing at all. Pay increases all round, lots of big jobs going to their cronies and their mates, getting a lot of money, and the actual result was next to zero. So I think that the Labour government then lost faith in the NHS altogether. They realised they were stuck with it politically, but they didn't like the idea. So from then on, it's been a matter of containment of cost. And this new NHS government is doing nothing more than the previous Tory government has done, which is to continue to try to keep the lid on the cost. Because actually the cost of the NHS has every capability of bankrupting this country if it was left to rip. and they can't afford to let it happen. So no matter what their private thoughts might be, they're stuck in a position where they can't do perhaps what they might like to be able to do because the money won't allow them.
So do you think, and I suppose I'm reminded of the Nuffield Trust report that came out at the end of last year with this one. I think that had in its title slow decay. So is it your sense then that this Labour government, despite some of the fine words spoken at the the conference earlier this year about the cavalry is coming, and some of the sort of positive stuff that's come out of the mouths of people like Wes Streeting in terms of their desire to change the situation, that actually they politically at least are they're pretty much handcuffed to the policies they've inherited?
They have no choice, because if you look at the list, the priority list, virtually half the hospitals in the country are in danger of falling down. The maintenance costs of keeping those hospitals going has been neglected for at least 30 years. Now, that's a problem that is going to cause trouble sooner or later. We're going to have a major hospital collapse. You look at the senior staffing. The senior staffing problems in management are that they're paying far too much money for people who are not very good. And then in terms of clinical staffing, they don't have enough people. They don't have enough people at the senior level, no matter how much they pay them, to be able to do the job properly. The juniors coming along, yes, they're coming along for a while, but what's happening? As soon as they get a whiff of what the NHS is really like to work for, they're having to leave because they can't live with it for much longer. So it's a good place to get a foothold. It's a good place to learn the trade, if you like. But when it comes to actually making money, the place is outside of the NHS. So the NHS has got a massive, massive list of problems that need to be solved a long, long time before you reach any talk of dental services.
And I mean, that's certainly been my sense from a little spell earlier in my career when I was actually part of Tony Blair's attempts to reform the NHS, working for the independent sector there, but in the wider medical world. And that I've found that very helpful to allow me to place dentistry in context. Yeah. And I totally agree with everything you've been saying. I think what I'm slightly struck by is, and it's an obvious point, the workforce issue. We seem to have fewer dentists wanting to work in the NHS, and those that, even in the private sector, that are working seem to want to work fewer clinical hours. Yeah. And in this day and age, compared to the 1990s when I started my career working with the profession, levels of productivity have nosedived, partly because of advancement of techniques, but also record keeping, the whole defensive dentistry, keeping the GDC at bay type thing. That means you just can't see the same number of patients in a day now that you could then, and that's before getting into a debate about the level of clinical skills that people are graduating with nowadays. But so you've got fewer dentists working fewer hours and being less productive in those hours. That to me, I don't know how a government can solve that quickly, and if it doesn't solve it quickly, I don't know how many NHS practices can be left, even if they want to be in the NHS, because they can't recruit associates to deliver the activity.
That's right. And what we're beginning to see, and I think one of the things you want to talk about is the ICB's looking at speculative buying into the market in sort of what I would call erratic contracting, which is trying to pay a few quid to solve a problem that's grown up in one part of their patch at the lowest possible cost, rather than having any kind of strategic approach to trying to provide a service that meets the requirements of the whole population. So what's the biggest issue from their point of view? What causes the major interest? And that is complaints about not being able to get care when a patient is in pain. So what are they doing? Looking around for people who take on responsibility for urgent care attention or one-off sessions and whatever. And you look and you think, what you're doing is you're nibbling at the edges of the problem. You're not actually dealing with the problem at all. And what you're doing in the process, you're ramping up the alleged standards that people have to abide by, and then saying, well, we can't afford to pay you anything reasonable to do that. And by the way, we also want you to see 30 patients in a session.
Yeah.
And, so
You might
people
remember
look at
a few years ago, I think the Federation of London LDCs made this point about tin-plated budget but gold standard expected, and it just seems to be exaggerated.
Yes, exactly right. And when you see that, if you look back at the history of the NHS, this what I call the initial game, where every few years we have to have a change of alleged leadership and a new board is created or something, and the ICBs are just another, the health authorities, they've all been a complete failure. I was looking at some figures for the ICBs, and the ICBs at the moment have started off with a cumulative shortfall in their funding across the country at £3.2 billion. Now, don't tell me that an organisation that's got part of a £3.2 billion deficit is going around looking at the strategic development of dental services. Come on, let's be realistic about it. It's not that I wouldn't like them to do that. Of course, I'd like them to do it, but the chances of them doing it are zero, absolutely zero, never going to happen. And that's the logic, and that's why our associates who are coming in nowadays. They don't even want to bother doing the NHS bit to start with. They want to come in straight to private, and I don't blame them. I really don't blame them, because what's the point in learning about the NHS when there's no intention of staying there for long? You may as well just cut it out and take the leap straight into the private sector. Why not? Because the private sector now has taken the place that was occupied quite firmly 40 years ago by the NHS, where it was the big player in the game. Now, private sector work is the big player in the game, and everybody else is looking to pick up the crumbs off the table.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, I look at how much we've been growing over the last few years, and it's I almost said astonishing there, but it isn't astonishing given the environment that we're in. But the acceptance of the public for private dentistry, the growth in the straighter, whiter teeth, and all of that side of things just seems to be creating a world of opportunity that is showing remarkable resilience in the face of a cost of living crisis. And yet here at the same time, the supply of clinical dentistry is falling away, it seems. So that puts the profession in a very, very strong position. So you're right when you said that one of the things I wanted to talk about was how practice owners might engage with the ICBs, because I years ago, actually, I worked with a dentist that decided he was going to go entirely private, very reluctantly, very socialist at heart, felt very uncomfortable with it. So he dealt with that by spending a day a week providing prison dentistry. It satisfied his social conscience. And I'm just wondering whether or not there's going to be this opportunity for those practices that go private, perhaps some of those that have been tendering for those emergency sessional contracts that you were talking about, to almost, it becomes part of their CSR strategy to engage with the ICBs, but on their terms. Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that you're quite right. There are plenty of people around who do feel some responsibility to the population at large. And there are two issues that, because I think that the private sector dentistry has done a fantastic job of building its PR profile in a very positive way by creating interest in many of the issues that the NHS, frankly, doesn't cover anymore. And I think that there are some political reasons behind wanting to do a little bit of NHS work if it fits in with the profile of the practice, and if you can get people to do it, because it gives you a little bit of leverage with the NHS locally. But I think as a PR stunt, it's very good as well. If you can say to people, well, yeah, we'd like to be able to provide more NHS care, but unfortunately the local board haven't got the money to be able to allow us to do that. So what we've decided to do is take some of that money, what's on offer, and we do some emergency work or some urgent care work or whatever it is that you decide to do. And it also provides an opportunity to get new patients into the practice who might never have set foot in the practice in the first place. You don't know. And therefore, the PR element of it is a distinct possibility. If people have got a conscience about it, that's fine. That I had that for years and years and years. I never gave up doing NHS work until 2006, when the UDA contract came in, and I was chairman of the BDA. And I said, you bring that in, and I'm going to tell the world I'm leaving the NHS. And I did. The date came in, I left the NHS and went entirely private. And I did another 10 years entirely private. So that was my transformation, but it was in response to active behavior on the part of the government. It wasn't me. I felt I was being driven in this direction. Now, because the playing field has changed, you don't have to go through the early stages that I went through for 30 odd years. You can actually walk straight into what is the real game now, and do perfectly well.
And I know that you've been involved in supporting practice owners for tendering for contracts for quite some time, and you'll have seen various bodies to negotiate with, and you've mentioned the ICBs as the latest incarnation of that. How are you finding their approach to the contracting process?
Well, let's just go back just a tiny step back to the tendering procedure. The tendering procedure was one of the most god-awful wastes of people's time, because the people who were reading the answers to the questions that were being asked didn't understand the answers. Clear, they weren't being read by anybody who knew what they were talking about. And as long as the accountancy side of it stood up, the rest of it could go hang. The whole of those documents, and they ran to 30 and 40 and 50 and 60 pages per document, and I've written them. And I got to the point where I was using AI to create the answers, because there's no point spending hours and hours working out how to write new answers for every individual, because there was nobody reading it who understood what you were telling them. And therefore, that process was completely bogus. It also took months and months and months to do anything. So what's emerging now is a very, very different looking model, where, for a start, the money is on offer. It's not the dentist bidding for the money, it's the chap with the money going out to the market to try to find somebody who'll take the money to do the job that they want doing. Do you see that the switch around is absolute, and it's exactly parallel to the point you were making, Nigel, about the fact that now the NHS is no longer in charge and the private taking whatever it can get. Now the private sector is determining what gets done on a day-to-day basis, and the NHS can come knocking on the door, but you might get a very short answer.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That move from being price takers to price makers.
That's right.
And I don't know that a lot of the profession have actually realised that's the position they're in.
No, but then, come on, we've been around the business a long time, Nigel. The dentist of today is no more business savvy than they were 40 or 50 years ago. I was astonished to find out when I was a relatively young man, just how non-business savvy the senior people around me were. They were dentists.
Yeah.
Full stop. They didn't know what they were doing when they were talking to people in senior positions in the NHS. Not because they were stupid, but because they didn't have the knowledge or the experience to be able to talk to them on an equal basis. That I was one of the first people to try and change that, and I certainly did it. And I got a lot of respect for that from the very people I'm talking about, because they all used to say, "Oh, John's here." now we're in trouble because he knows as much about this business as we do. Oh, now let's get, what are we going to go from here? So the people today who may be accused of being non-business savvy are not guilty, any more guilty than their predecessors. I don't want anybody going away thinking I'm saying the young dentists of today are not as bright as they ought to be and they don't understand. The dentists have never understood because their business is about doing dentistry, not running a business.
Yeah, it's like anything, isn't it? You get better at what you practice, and actually, if you don't have that much exposure, that ability to practice those skills, because actually the treadmill that you're on is running faster and faster every year. You know, it's harder and harder to keep up with those kind of negotiation skills, because that's what you're describing, isn't it? And I guess that's where you come in and can help people.
Well, you see, I had a case only the other day of a client of mine who's trying to buy a practice, and it was valued at £305,000, the asking price, and no names, no pattern. And I said, well, how long has it been empty? And the answer was 18 months. And I said, and what do you think that does to the value? Because it's not selling. Why is it not selling? Not because the price is too high, it's because nobody's even talking about the price. They don't want the business in the first place. Because it's an NHS practice. And therefore, I think you should at least chop the price in half. And if the guy wants to sell it, fine, or he can wait another 5 years to find nobody else wants it either. The business of negotiation, you know, people say, well, should I offer 295? Not in my life, my sunshine. No, you are not going to offer 295. Offer him 150 and see if he wets himself. And and that kind of thing, you know, when you sat around the table with senior politicians who actually are no better at it either. So don't, you know, let's not kid ourselves, they know what they're doing. Some of the civil servants do, but the politicians are no better. But the idea of talking over the potential cost of running a service and being able to point out where the cost centres are going to go and where the money's going to go and why it costs so much money, that is a skill that you don't have if you don't ever get into that situation.
Yeah, or you get into that situation once every 10, 15 years or something. It's I mean, it's interesting because you're basically describing the position of strength, that example that you gave about the £300,000 practice, the position of strength that the person potentially purchasing the practice is in. And that is another reminder for me of that strength of position that the profession is in. And we're working with practice after practice after practice that surpasses its expectations when it goes fully private. They still retain that social conscience. So there's that potential to re-engage with the ICB on their terms. Just it may not happen, and they may have to find another way of satisfying their social conscience. But how do you see things evolving over the next few years?
Oh yes, I can, and I think that there is a pathway, but which way the pathway goes depends far more on the government than it does on dentists. Because my view is, from a government point of view, the less and less money that goes into NHS dentistry, as far as they're concerned, the better. It doesn't matter to them. They have no social conscience about what happens to the patients. None. Believe you me, they have none. Zero. Anybody who thinks that politicians care about their voters, they only care about them once every 5 years when they've got a tick on a box, and that's when your vote goes in. That's the only time they're interested. I was looking at these figures. I've got the relative costs of the GDS in England back in 2004. Just before the UDA contract came in, and looking at it today, And we know what's happened roughly, because the cost in 2004 for the GDS, these figures are for England. And please don't think I'm doing an English thing here. It just happens to be the figures I've got, because the figures are the same for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. The cost of the service in 2004 was £2.3 billion. And now here we are at 2024, the latest figures I've got is that the cost of the GDS in England is now £2.3 billion. Now, you could take the view that they've saved themselves £100 million. Well, that's hardly worth the bother. But if inflation, which has gone up 67.5% between 2004 and 2024, the cost should have been £3.75 billion. Now, you think, well, that's not very much. That's only £1.5 billion. We only started off with £2 billion. The cost of the service has been reduced almost by half without doing anything very much. Now, part of that is because the dentists have taken it into their own hands to take their action in response to government attitudes. But the rest of it is down to plain, straightforward government indifference to the NHS and dental service, and recognising that they have far bigger fish to fry than us.
I mean, it's been fascinating, and we, I always like to try and keep podcasts to around 15-20 minutes, and we've gone smashing through that, John, because it's just been so interesting. So I guess my final question is around, if we're coming up to the next election. I mean, the last election, dentistry was quite high up the agenda for a lot of voters. What kind of situation will it be in at the time of the next general election?
My view is that the next general election might only be 12 months away.
Right. That's very interesting.
This new government has made a total disaster start. They've alienated very successfully a great many of their core voters, and they've made a bigger mess of some of the issues that were already on the table than the previous Conservative government did. So my view is that unless they turn around and do something different, they will find themselves in all sorts of bother. Now, if they end up coming to the voters again in 12 months' time, what we're talking about will matter nothing at all, because the whole thing will be a disaster. If we go back to a different scenario where in 5 years' time, Keir has managed to sort himself out and find some people to rely on that are worth talking to, then we're talking about a different kettle of fish altogether. And a lot will depend. The Labour Party have always gone big on their responsibility for the NHS, but they have never, ever matched it with funding. They've always talked it up, but they've never actually delivered the funding. So it's almost wishes and promises, which are much more, if you like, appealing than the government of the Tory colour, generally often saying, we can't afford any more money, we'll have to make do with what we've got, which is more of a Tory line. But the result is the same. And if you look at what's happened to the NHS over the last 30 years, with Tony Blair, 97, running up to 2010, David Cameron, etc., up to 2024, are you telling me you can tell the difference between those two groups? Because I can't.
Yeah.
13 years of one, 14 years of the other. And that's because they cannot raise the revenue, the income revenue, the taxing revenue, to be able to solve some of the big problems that they're facing. I think technically, if you and I were running this country as a business, we would be staring bankruptcy in the face. And that is the problem. And Keir isn't going to be able to find a solution to that problem. Rishi and his predecessors couldn't find a solution to that problem because we're not exporting enough, we're not making enough money, we're living beyond our means. And one of the biggest cost centres is the NHS. And the NHS cannot be solved overnight with a few quid in an envelope put in the back pocket of somebody who can help out. Not going to happen. And I think that no matter where we go, this model, this business model that the NHS is 1948 onwards has never, ever, ever been successful. And it's gone on getting more and more costly, and the disaster facing this country when the system breaks down, which it will, is heading there already. Anybody who tells me the NHS in good condition, you don't know what you're talking about. The NHS is falling apart. The hospitals are falling apart. Recruitment is falling apart. But it's just a mess. So my view is that what you're going to get the next time round is a lot more promises like you got this time. Nothing will have changed.
No, well, it's fascinating, especially your take on what the next 12 months might look like, and I can certainly see it's been a challenging start, and not exactly what one would describe as a honeymoon period.
No,
so,
not at all, not at all. So, no, I wouldn't have wanted to face it either.
No, absolutely. I am. For all my criticism of them, I'm intensely glad I'm not a politician. So, but John, thank you so much for your time today. Really, thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I would love to pick this up again periodically over the course of this parliamentary term, no matter how long it turns out to be. So,
well, if they actually come up with something useful, I'd be more than happy to come back and talk to you again.
Yeah, well, that would be great. I really appreciate that, because as we sort of kicked off this conversation, touching on, there aren't many people that have had your experience and have your collection of perspectives that you can bring to this challenge. So thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. Very welcome.